It is the morning of June 6th, 1944. Somewhere in the Normandy countryside, hidden behind the tall green hedgerows, a battery of German guns is firing. Each blast rolls across the fields like distant thunder, and every shell is falling on Utah Beach, where thousands of American soldiers are coming ashore. Crawling toward those guns through the wet grass is a small group of paratroopers, far fewer than the men waiting for them. At their head is a quiet young lieutenant named Dick Winters. He has no artillery of his own, no tanks, and almost no time. What he is about to do in the next hour will be studied by soldiers for generations. Those guns are not firing blindly. They are zeroed in on a narrow causeway leading off the beach, a raised road where American troops and vehicles are bunched together with nowhere to hide. As long as the battery keeps firing, men are dying on that causeway. Winters has perhaps a dozen soldiers with him, gathered from the chaos of the night. Dug in around the guns is a much larger force, somewhere around 50 German defenders, sheltered in a network of trenches and connected positions. Attacking a fixed, defended battery with a handful of men is one of the most dangerous tasks in all of warfare, and there is no one else coming to do it. The place was a Norman farm called Brécourt Manor. The fight that unfolded there on D-Day morning was small, over in little more than an hour, and easy to lose among the giant events of that day. Yet, it would become one of the most famous small-unit actions in American military history. For decades afterward, it has been taught to officer cadets at West Point as a model of how a tiny force can take a strong position. The man who planned and led it was First Lieutenant Richard Winters, known to everyone simply as Dick. Calm, fair, and absolutely fearless when it counted, he was about to give the performance of a lifetime. But how did a dozen lightly armed paratroopers, scattered miles from where they were supposed to land, end up charging a fortified battery alone? How did one ordinary young officer from Pennsylvania keep his head while everything around him came apart, and turn a desperate situation into a victory soldiers still study today? To understand what happened in that field, we have to go back a few hours to the darkness over Normandy and to a parachute jump that went very nearly as wrong as a jump can go. That is where the story of Dick Winters and the guns of Brécourt truly begins. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like. To understand how Dick Winters came to be crawling toward those guns, we have to return to the night before, to the 6th of June, 1944, and to the largest airborne assault the world had ever seen. Richard Winters was not a loud man. He came from a modest home in Pennsylvania, did not drink or boast, and led by quiet example rather than by shouting. He had joined the paratroopers, the toughest and most demanding part of the new airborne army, and trained until he and his men could outmarch and outfight anyone. His unit was Easy Company, part of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the famous 101st Airborne Division. The men had suffered together through brutal training, and many of them trusted Winters more than they trusted any other officer. On the night of the invasion, that trust was about to be tested as never before. Late on the night of June 5th, Winters and thousands of other paratroopers climbed into their transport planes and lifted off toward France. As they crossed into Normandy, the sky erupted around them. Clouds, confusion, and heavy fire scattered the formations, and the pilots swerved and climbed as they tried to escape it. Men were thrown out over unfamiliar country, far from their targets, landing alone or in small groups in the dark. Winters himself came down miles from where he should have, with most of his equipment torn away in the jump, armed with little more than a knife. All across the Norman fields, the airborne army had been flung into chaos. In the grey light of early morning, Winters did what good leaders do in a disaster. He started gathering men. Paratroopers from different units drifted together along the hedgerows, and Winters pulled a small band of them into a fighting force. Word came down that a battery of guns was firing on Utah Beach, cutting into the troops coming ashore, and that someone needed to silence them. The order passed to Winters was as simple and as terrifying as orders get. Take care of those guns. He was given no extra men, no heavy weapons, and no detailed plan, only a direction to march and a job that had to be done. Winters moved his small group forward through the fields until he could see the problem for himself. Behind a screen of hedgerows sat the guns, 4 of them, dug deep into the earth and carefully hidden from the air. Around them ran a system of trenches, with foxholes and firing positions covering every approach. Defending it all was a force several times the size of his own. For a moment, the scale of it must have been staggering. A handful of scattered paratroopers were looking at a fortified battery held by perhaps 50 men. Most officers would have waited for help. Winters decided he could not afford to wait. Instead of rushing in, Winters took a few precious seconds to think. A headlong charge across open ground would get his men cut down before they reached the first gun. So he studied the land like a chess player, and he saw that the same hedgerows hiding the guns could hide his men as well. His plan was simple and bold. He would split his tiny force, set up 2 machine guns to pin the defenders down, and sweep along the trench, while a small assault team crept close under cover and rushed the first gun. Speed, surprise, and aggression would have to make up for everything he'd lacked in numbers. He gave each man a job. The names would later become famous to millions: Compton, Guarnere, Malarkey, Lipton, a handful of others, ordinary young Americans about to do something extraordinary. Some took up positions with the machine guns, ready to rake the trench line and keep the defenders' heads down. Others gathered with Winters for the assault itself, checking grenades and weapons in the last seconds before the attack. There was almost no time for fear. Winters spoke quickly and clearly, made sure every man understood his part, and then got ready to lead the first rush himself. It was the only way he knew how to command. When the machine guns opened up, Winters went first. He did not stand behind his men and point them forward. He led the charge toward the nearest gun, with his soldiers right behind him. Bursting through the smoke and noise, the assault team reached the edge of the first position and dropped into the trench. The fighting there was sudden and close, a confused struggle at arm's length among the earthen walls. In a few violent moments it was over, and the first of the 4 guns was in American hands. But Winters knew that taking 1 gun was only the beginning. 3 more waited down the line, and the defenders were far from finished. Holding that first gun was almost as hard as taking it. The captured position sat in the open, swept by fire from the defenders further along the trench. Winters moved constantly, directing his men, pointing out targets, and keeping everyone low and working together. He placed soldiers to cover the trench in both directions, so the position could not be rushed back. All the while, the larger force around the battery was trying to push the paratroopers back out. The pressure was relentless, and Winters had to think faster than the men trying to stop him. He had taken a single gun. Now he intended to take them all. It was at one of the gun positions that Winters' men made a discovery that turned out to be almost as valuable as the guns themselves. Tucked away among the equipment was a map, and it was no ordinary one. Marked across it were the positions of light and machine guns spread throughout the surrounding region. Quietly carried back and sent to headquarters, that single map gave Allied commanders a priceless picture of the defenses across the area. The fight at Brécourt was not only silencing the guns, it was handing the invasion force a window into the enemy's plans at the very moment it was needed most. With the first gun secured, Winters turned the battle into a method. One by one, he would take the guns the same way, using fire to pin the defenders while small groups worked their way along the trench to the next position. It was brutal, careful, exhausting work, fought at close range in a maze of earth and hedgerow. Each gun meant another rush, another struggle in the trench, another moment when everything could go wrong. Winters seemed to be everywhere at once, leading, encouraging, and making cool decisions while the air around him was alive with danger. Slowly, position by position, the battery was being torn out of enemy hands. Winters knew his luck could not hold forever, and he sent word back, asking for more men. A few more paratroopers made their way forward to join the fight, just enough to keep the momentum going. But the cost was real. In the close fighting among the trenches, some of Winter's men were hit, and a small number of them would not be going home. He felt every loss, even in the middle of the battle. These were not strangers to him. They were soldiers he had trained and lived beside for 2 years. Yet he could not stop. The guns were still a threat, and the only way to protect the beach was to keep going forward. Taking a gun was not enough. Each one had to be put out of action for good. Winter's men set to work disabling the captured howitzers so they could never fire on the beach again. With blocks of explosive and whatever they could improvise, they wrecked the great barrels one after another, the blasts sending dirt and smoke rolling across the field. Each ruined gun was one less weapon falling on the men at Utah Beach. The paratroopers worked fast, knowing the longer they stayed, the more dangerous their position became. They had come to silence this battery, and they meant to leave nothing behind that could ever speak again. By the time the paratroopers reached the last guns, more help had arrived. A small group from another company came up to join the fight, including a daring young officer named Ronald Spears. In a moment that would become legend, Spears sprinted straight through the contested positions to reach the final gun and knock it out, a wild dash that astonished the men who saw it. With that, the work was done. All 4 guns of the battery had been taken and destroyed, and the trench line that had bristled with defenders was finally falling silent. The impossible task Winters had been handed at dawn was very nearly complete. It is easy, all these years later, to lose sight of what those 4 guns meant. Each of them was a heavy weapon capable of throwing shells for miles, and all of them had been aimed at the causeways leading off Utah Beach. Every minute they kept firing, more American soldiers were falling on that crowded stretch of road. By silencing the battery, Winters and his men lifted a deadly weight off the entire beachhead. Soldiers who never knew his name owed him their lives that morning. In the vast machinery of D-Day, one small group in one Norman field had quietly changed the fate of thousands. When it was over, the numbers told an astonishing story. With around a dozen men at the start, reinforced by only a few more, Winters had attacked and destroyed a battery defended by perhaps 50 soldiers. His losses, though painful, were remarkably light compared to the scale of what he had taken on. The defenders had been driven off or captured, the guns wrecked, and that priceless map was already on its way to headquarters. For a force so small to overcome one so much larger, in a prepared position, was the kind of result that sounded almost unbelievable. Yet dozens of witnesses had seen it happen with their own eyes. In the years that followed, military instructors looked closely at what had happened at Brécourt Manor, and they realized Winters had done something close to textbook perfect. He had used surprise, kept his opponents pinned with steady fire, struck hard with a small assault team, and pressed his advantage without hesitation. Above all, he had led from the front, sharing every danger he asked his men to face. The attack became a classic case study in how a small, determined force can defeat a much larger one in a fixed position. For decades, it has been taught to young officers as an example of leadership and tactics done right. What made Dick Winters special was not loud heroics. It was the calm. In the middle of the most frightening morning of his life, he had stayed clear-headed, made good decisions quickly, and thought of his men before himself. His soldiers noticed, and they would follow him anywhere for the rest of the war. His simple motto, "Hang tough," said everything about the way he led. He never asked his men to take a risk he would not take first, and he never lost the quiet decency that set him apart. The guns of Brécourt did not just silence a battery. They revealed the kind of leader the war had been waiting for. For his actions that morning, Dick Winters was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award the United States Army can give. Several of the men who fought beside him received Silver Stars and other honors for their courage in the same field. For many years afterward, veterans and supporters argued that Winters deserved the Medal of Honor itself, and a long campaign was waged to have his award upgraded. Whatever the medal on his chest, the men who were there had no doubt about what they had witnessed. They had seen one of the finest small actions of the entire war, led by one of the finest officers they ever knew. Brécourt was only the beginning of Easy Company's long road. In the weeks and months that followed, Winters and his men fought on through the hard fields of Normandy, then jumped again into Holland during the great Airborne battle that autumn. They froze and held the line in the snow at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge and fought their way at last into the heart of Germany. Winters rose steadily in rank until he commanded the whole battalion. Through all of it, he carried the same quiet steadiness he had shown at the guns, and his men kept following him all the way to the end of the war in Europe. When the war finally ended, Dick Winters did not seek fame or fortune. He went home to Pennsylvania, married, and built a quiet life, working and farming in the countryside he loved. For many years, few outside his old unit knew what he had done on D-Day. Then a famous book, and later a celebrated television series, told the story of Easy Company to millions, and the modest farmer became a hero to a whole new generation. Winters bore it all with the same humility he had always shown. He lived a long life, honored and beloved, and died in 2011, having never stopped insisting that the real heroes were the men who did not come home. It would be easy to remember Brécourt only as a clever piece of tactics, a lesson in a textbook. But it was far more than that. It was a morning when a small group of frightened, ordinary young men trusted one another and a quiet leader, and did something that saved the lives of strangers they would never meet. Dick Winters never wanted to be called a hero. He wanted his men remembered by name for what they gave. So we end with them, the soldiers of Easy Company, who jumped into the dark and silenced the guns at dawn. If someone in your family served on D-Day or anywhere in that long war, share their name in the comments and let us remember them together. They deserve to be remembered, everyone.